What's in a Name by Anne Williams. Growing up in Greenock in the 50s and 60s, I was quite fond of my surname Denham. I felt it was a bit different from the run-of-the-mill names of my classmates, Lynch, Kelly, Mooney, etc. Being near the beginning of the alphabet too meant I was usually near the front of the queue for things that were arranged alphabetically, though that was not always a blessing when they were doling out the regular polio jags. I wondered where my name had originated and came to the conclusion that it was from the town in Buckinghamshire of the same name. In Scotland, the more usual spelling of the name is Denholm, and since there is a town of that name in the Scottish borders, I deduced that the Scottish line had derived from there, and that possibly, if I went back far enough, I would find that they were branches of the same family tree. When, as part of the identity project on immigration, I started to trace my roots, I assumed that I would be able to establish that my family was indeed an immigrant clan in the area. I started with my father's mother, Annie McAllister, as I knew that she had moved to the Greenock area from Campbelltown. She was born in Ballgram Street in Campbelltown in 1883 to Archibald McAllister, a carter, and his wife, Helen Meek. Her father was also born in Campbelltown around 1847 to another Archibald McAllister, who was a hawker, and his wife, Anne McEwen. Her mother, Helen, was born in Main Street, Campbelltown in 1861 to James Meek, a soldier, and his wife, Helen McFadgen. Archie McAllister Jr. and Helen Meek married in St Kieran's Catholic Church in Campbelltown in 1879. The 1891 census shows them living in Ballgram Street with their 4 daughters and 2 sons. Sadly, my great-grandfather Archie died in 1893 and his widow Helen moved with the family to Greenock, living in Westburn Street. In 1897, she married Donald McNaughton, a bachelor from Campbelltown, who was a neighbour in Westburn Street. In the 1901 census, my grandmother Annie was living in Nicholson Street with her mother and stepfather, her brothers Archibald, Henry and Joseph, and her 2 new half-sisters, Mary and Jane. On leaving school, she had found employment in one of the local rope works and was working there in 1903 when she married my grandfather. My grandfather, Thomas Denham, at first glance appeared to be an immigrant as well, but when he moved to the area, he was in fact returning to his roots. He was born in Govan in Glasgow in 1883, but his mother, my great-grandmother Georgina Fleming, was born in Greenock in 1844 to John Fleming and Catherine Nelson. Georgina was the 3rd daughter. John Fleming was a customs officer, as the Hutchison's Greenock Directory of 1845-46 illustrates. There had been a customs presence in Greenock since the early part of the 18th century as a response to the smuggling activities rife in the lower Clyde at the time. The early offices are thought to have been in Cathcart Street and West Quay. The present custom house was built in 1818 by the Edinburgh-based company of William Byrne at a total cost of £30,000. At the time it was deemed to be the finest custom house in Britain, and its size reflects the high volume of trade conducted in Greenock. Although the building is still there, it sadly no longer houses HM Customs staff. On the quay in front of the custom house stands a handsome Corinthian pillar, on top of which is a beautiful light which was erected to facilitate the approach of steam and sailing vessels to the quay at night. Unfortunately, John Fleming died after the birth of his son in 1847, and in the 1851 census his wife was living on an annuity in Tobago Street with her 3 daughters and 4-year-old son John. By 1861 she had moved to Dalrymple Street with Georgina and John. The 16-year-old Georgina was described as a straw bonnet maker, but by the time of her marriage in 1867 she was living in Kinning Park in Glasgow and had progressed to dressmaker. The Church of Scotland ceremony between Georgina Fleming and Robert Denham took place in her home in St James's Terrace in August 1867. Robert Denham was born in Ashtree Cottage on Port Glasgow Road in Greenock in 1840. He was the 4th son of William Denham, a blacksmith, and his wife Jane Campbell. He was still living there and working as an engine fitter at the time of his marriage to Georgina. After their marriage, Robert and Georgina lived in St Lawrence Street in Cartstike. They had two sons, William, born in 1868, and John, born in 1869. By the time his sons were born, Robert was a seagoing marine engineer and in 1875 sailed to Shanghai in China on board the sailing vessel Fuchao. Shanghai's history is relatively short in comparison to many other Chinese cities. The British opened up a concession there after the First Opium War and ignited Shanghai's evolution. With a population of 23 million, it is now the most populated city in the world. Its location at the mouth of the Yangtze River in the middle of the Chinese coast created the opportunity for a busy trading post. Today it is a major financial centre and the busiest container port in the world, but in Robert Denham's time it would have been a bustling port on the main trading routes between Europe and the Far East and Australia. Robert died on 8th of July 1875 while the ship was in Shanghai and was buried there. The accompanying entry in his marine records shows the amount due to his estate at the time of his death, but not the cause of death. Details of his death are also poignantly recorded on my grandfather's birth certificate 8 years later, but in modern parlance, if you do the math, he was clearly not his father. Although he had obviously no right to the Denham name, other than it was his mother's married name, it did not prevent him starting his own dynasty in Greenock. In 1903, Thomas Denham married Annie McAllister in St Mary's Church in the town. The couple had 8 children in total, 4 sons, Archibald, Thomas, my father, Joseph and Henry, and 4 daughters, Georgina, known as Ina, Helen, who died in infancy, Mary and Margaret. The 1911 census shows them living in West Blackhall Street with the first 4 of their children. The other 4 were born later, as well as my grandmother's stepfather, Donald McNaughton, her 2 brothers, Henry and Joseph, and half-sister Mary. My grandparents subsequently moved to Hope Street, where they lived until their deaths in 1943 and 1944. Their children settled in Greenock, with the exception of 1 daughter, Margaret, and 1 son, Henry. Margaret and her sister Mary had worked in the Caledonian Foundry during the Second World War. Women were taken on for the duration because of the shortage of men. Of course, when the war ended and the soldiers returned to Civvy Street, the women were all dismissed so that the men could get their jobs back. There was no sexual equality in the workplace in those days. Undaunted, Margaret replied to an advert in the Greenock Telegraph and after an interview in the Tontine Hotel was offered a job in an hotel in the Derbyshire village of Hathersage. Despite taunts from her brothers that she'd be home within a week, she settled into life in her English village, marrying a local man and raising 3 children there. She was in fact the longest surviving of the siblings when she died in Derbyshire in 2010 at the grand old age of 85. Perhaps encouraged by his sister's move, Henry also left the area, though his was a bit more adventurous. In 1950, with his wife and 2 daughters, he emigrated to northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, where he worked in the copper mines. The accompanying photo shows the assembled family, including my 3-year-old self, at his farewell party. Henry and his family eventually moved to South Africa, where they lived till their deaths. Bringing the saga to a close, my own father Thomas was killed in a shipyard accident in 1953. My youngest sister Jean, following her grandfather's precedent, was born after her father's death, but by a mere 2 months, not the 8 years of her ancestor. This short narrative covers only my father's heritage. My next challenge is to investigate my mother's family history to find out if they were natives or immigrants. In a postscript to our branch of the Denham clan, the name will no longer exist in the Inverclyde area within a generation. Of the 14 children produced by the 4 sons of Thomas Denham and Annie McAllister, only 2 were boys, both of whom left the area. At the moment, the only descendant of my grandparents still bearing the name is my eldest unmarried sister Mary. When she eventually goes to a better place, the name will die with her. Perhaps with some justification, as it was never really ours in the first place.